The cold demeanor of the elite female doctor melted away, revealing a vulnerable woman. "I need you," she whispered. Unable to resist her heartfelt plea, My name is Kyle, and I'll be turning 36 this year. I work as a freelance writer. Leveraging my previous experience as a doctor, I now write about medical topics. There's a good demand for my work, so I'm not in urgent need of work. Up until 3 years ago, I worked as a doctor at a university hospital. I don't like to brag, but I was quite popular among the patients. I believe I was the best surgeon among my peers. But these days, I've distanced myself from my old friends from medical school and my time as a doctor. To be frank, I don't want to see them. Many colleagues look down on me for leaving the university hospital. I know they say behind my back that I ran away from the demanding environment. Even though my salary has dropped significantly since then, I'm quite content with my current job and lifestyle. Then, out of the blue, I received news that my old mentor had passed away. A friend informed me that Professor Johnson, a mentor of mine from my college days, had passed away. For a moment, the news left me speechless. To me, Professor Johnson was not just a mentor but also someone I had a complicated history with. A friend asked, "You're coming to the funeral, right?" I hesitated for a moment but managed to reply, "I will." Professor Johnson was a devout Catholic. The funeral was originally supposed to be held at the church Professor Johnson attended, but due to the large expected turnout, it was moved to a funeral home in New York City. Still, many priests and nuns were present, and the funeral mass went on without a hitch. I wasn't familiar with the hymns and was attending a Catholic funeral for the first time, so I just followed the crowd. Many of the faces at the funeral were friends and colleagues I'd been avoiding, making me feel out of place. Some were whispering and glancing in my direction. I think I was the first of my college classmates to leave the front lines of medicine early. Most of my peers are still working hard as doctors. I decided to leave as soon as the funeral was over. I somewhat regretted attending, feeling this wasn't where I belonged. As I lay flowers on Professor Johnson lying in his coffin, I recall a conversation I once had with the professor. It was the talk that had pushed me to leave the university hospital. I always wanted to ask him what he really meant by those words. And even now, those feelings hadn't changed. After the funeral, I watched as Professor Johnson's coffin was taken away. The funeral's main mourner was Professor Johnson's wife. Our eyes met, and I gave a slight nod. She smiled kindly at me. Suddenly, a voice behind me snapped, "Look, who finally showed up. The very man who betrayed Professor Johnson." I was grabbed by the shoulder and forcibly turned around. It was a former colleague and classmate from college. Now a top surgeon at the university hospital, Emily. She had been a close friend during our time at the university hospital, and my ex-girlfriend. Her eyes were red, probably from crying. But her face was filled more with anger than sadness. And that anger was directed at me. I felt her grip tighten. I was more concerned about her hurting her hand than the pain I felt. Her right hand is the hand that saves many patients. She's not just any random right-hand woman. If you exert that much force, you'll hurt your finger. Emily's eyes widened at my words. The next moment, she forcefully removed her hand from my shoulder. "Why bring this up now? Go back to the countryside, you loser." Pushing away our mutual friends who tried to intervene, Emily hurled insults at me. Coward, loser, deserter, irresponsible, I've heard them all before. I felt like laughing at the absurdity, hurriedly covering my mouth with my hand. The more seriously Emily cursed me, the more ridiculous I felt. "It's okay to scold me, but don't you have anything else to say, Emily?" I'm tired of hearing the same things." Even though I knew I was provoking her, my sarcastic tone remained unchanged. Emily's face turned bright red with anger and embarrassment. She had always been like this. Always trying to do the right thing, always taking patients seriously. But her strict attitude towards both herself and others often led to misunderstandings. The harder she tried, the less patients liked her, leaving her isolated at work. Yet, her spirit and ideals never wavered. She probably didn't realize that her diligent attitude, without any arrogance about her own skills, was almost suffocating for me. I looked at Emily, who was glaring at me while breathing heavily, with pity. She never doubts that what she knows is the only truth. I find Emily's candor like that annoying. Raising your voice and causing a scene here, is this the education my father provided? If so, he failed as an educator. The one who broke the tense atmosphere between me and Emily was a woman with a deep, commanding voice. All eyes turned to her. A woman wearing a black morning dress and a veiled top hat stood there. Wearing a top hat meant she was a relative of Professor Johnson. I recalled, she's a professor's only daughter. Wait, what? I understood that she was Professor Johnson's daughter, but I was taken aback. I thought I was meeting her for the first time, but underneath that black veil was a familiar face. Then I remembered that her last name was also Johnson. "Kyle, thank you for attending my father's funeral." The woman, who addressed me in a monotone without bowing, was Ava Johnson, whom I often saw at the publishing company building. Although we wrote in completely different genres, we both freelanced for the publisher and often met at related parties. Ava, famous among us writers for her audacity, unconventional approach, and beauty, was someone I'd occasionally grab a drink with. "What? Ava is Professor Johnson's problematic daughter." Unable to contain my surprise, I blurted out. Ava frowned, replying, "Choose your words carefully. Why didn't you tell me sooner? You never asked." The fact that Professor Johnson's only daughter was famous among his students for being a problem child. Professor Johnson occasionally complained about her. Professor Johnson, who was adored as a personable professor, was often asked by his students what kind of person his only daughter was, whom he could not handle. Who would have thought my writer friend, Ava, was that very person? "Ah, so you're the professor's daughter. I've heard quite a bit about you." Emily's face couldn't quite hide her irritation as she greeted, with a sense of doing it out of obligation. After all, she's the daughter of our mentor. We couldn't afford to be rude. Ava stared at Emily with an emotionless expression. "Emily, right, my father often mentioned you were an excellent surgeon. It's our first time meeting, isn't it?" Ava's overly polite response seemed incredibly condescending to me, who knew her usual demeanor very well. Without a doubt, Ava was mocking Emily. "This is between him and me. It has nothing to do with you, young lady, does it?" Kyle is my friend. I'm not the type to stand by and watch a friend get wrongly blamed." Ava replied with a sly smile, tilting her head slightly. "I know her all too well. The angrier she gets, the more she smiles. And I was sure that she didn't step between Emily and me for my sake. It's not about blaming him. I just want Kyle to come back to the university hospital. Professor Johnson had always hoped for that too. He always cared about Kyle." Hearing Emily's words, old memories became vivid in my mind. It was back when I worked at the university hospital. Emily and I, once lovers, both strived and pushed forward in our careers as doctors, I believe. I took pride in my work. I have grown accustomed to being called doctor by my patients. Professor Johnson looked unusually downcast that day. His face was gloomy, devoid of his usual smile. Concerned, I asked, "Is everything all right?" Professor Johnson murmured, "It's about my daughter. She has both the ability and academic performance to become a doctor, but she's adamant about not taking the medical school entrance exam. He said she has a nightly battle with her mother, who tells her to apply to medical school. To be honest, I'm fine with either decision. I've even considered adopting a son-in-law, but she's against that idea too. What should I do? The Johnsons has been famous for being a family of doctors for generations. He choked on his words, saying that it would be a shame to end it in his generation. I can't understand what's so bad about becoming a doctor. It's beyond my understanding. I carelessly blurted out. Professor Johnson looked at me a little surprised. A hint of surprise in his eyes, and then his expression hardened. I now realize how arrogant I was back then. Being constantly addressed as doctor and revered by my patients, I felt like my job was superior to others. I was intoxicated with the idea of saving lives. Thinking too highly of myself. Professor Johnson didn't miss the arrogance in my heart. Kyle, one day you might face challenges in this medical profession. It won't be just your problem. It might also affect the patients whose lives are in your hands. Confused, I couldn't grasp what Professor Johnson was trying to convey. Seeing that his words weren't getting through to me, he let out a deep sigh. I was aware I had disappointed him, but I couldn't figure out exactly why. However, it is hard to understand which words and which attitude disappointed the professor so much. You're bound to stumble. You should leave before that happens. He left me with those words. Only when he turned the corner of the hallway did I realize he meant I should leave the hospital. I was considered one of the top students among Professor Johnson's mates, and he had told me to leave. More than shock, anger bubbled up. For the first time, I felt a clear resentment towards Professor Johnson. Carrying that anger, I went on with my afternoon appointments. And that day turned into a storm of complaints. Of course it did. I think I unfairly took out my frustration on a patient. I wonder where my calm self went, drowning in self-loathing. Over the weekend, I handed in my resignation. Watching Emily work and comparing with myself, I realized I was no longer needed at this hospital. I was deeply impressed by Emily, who, despite being called a top-tier doctor, humbly and earnestly tried to save her patients. Perhaps Professor Johnson was concerned about me for that very reason. Emily wants me back at the hospital, but I believe Professor Johnson didn't feel the same way. Emily, you're lying, right? I bet Professor Johnson never said he wanted me back. Upon hearing my words, Emily looked surprised, saying, "Oh." For the first time, I explained to Emily why I left the university hospital. I told her that it was Professor Johnson's words that made me realize I shouldn't be a doctor. Both Emily and my colleagues listened to my confession with bated breath. I left the hospital because I was sick of my own immaturity as a doctor and as a person. Even after hearing the truth, Emily couldn't accept it and kept arguing with me. I'm tired of hearing her repeated why and how come. Professor Johnson just wanted to motivate you. You misunderstood him. Come back to the hospital. Let's start over, okay? Emily, unable to accept what I said, was desperate to persuade me. I'm right, and you're wrong. It seemed to be written on Emily's face that this was why she had to make it right. Ava watched Emily expressionlessly. Suddenly, Ava shifted her gaze from Emily to me. Our eyes met instantly. Ava smiled slyly when our eyes locked. We are students of Professor Johnson. Be proud and confident, Emily exclaimed, almost shouting. I get it. My father was a respectable doctor and professor, but he got sick and couldn't beat the disease. Ava's words took Emily by surprise. All the proud and brilliant students couldn't save my father. Ava threw those harsh words at Emily. Ava is trying to verbally overpower Emily. I've heard that when Professor Johnson collapsed, Emily was the one on duty that night. The person most regretful about not being able to save Professor Johnson's life was Emily herself. Emily bit her lower lip, to which Ava smiled faintly. Your dedication and emergency treatment were admirable, but that's it. My father passed away. Faced with this brutal reality, Emily seemed to want to cover her ears. Her body was shaking slightly. But he can't even do that, Ava said slowly, pointing at me. If Professor Johnson had been brought in, could I have treated him? I'm sure I won't be able to stay calm. I might have panicked and run away. Feeling exposed, I was lost for words. I'm a coward. Still, that's why I'm scared of facing the medical field on my own. I want your support. I was taken aback by the sight of Emily that I had never seen before. I need you. Those were Emily's true feelings. She collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face. I wanted to comfort her, but I felt I wasn't worthy. Crying, Emily kept saying, I want you to be with me. Looking down at her with a smile, Ava watched her. Then, making sure Emily didn't notice, Ava gently kicked my leg, urging my indecisive self. After that kick, Ava silently walked towards the exit. Her back was straight, showing no hesitation. It felt as though she displayed a genuine strength, unlike the facade shown by Emily. I gently knelt beside Emily, speaking to her softly. I offered her the most comforting words I could muster. I can support you from afar, and I'll always be watching over you. It had been 7 years since Professor Johnson passed away. There wasn't any specific memorial service, so all I could do was offer a silent prayer in my heart. In front of me sat Emily, aged gracefully over those 7 years, with a smile. I turned on my voice recorder and began the interview. Recently, Emily had successfully performed one of the world's most challenging surgeries. The fact that she was a female surgeon of Canadian descent was making headlines. I never went back to the university hospital. Instead, I continued my career as a freelance medical writer. After Professor Johnson's funeral, I think my relationship with Emily improved a bit. Emily never again told me to come back to the hospital, and I began interviewing my former classmates and colleagues from the university without any avoidance. Many doctors confided in me, telling me stories they wouldn't share with other writers. I have become quite valued among publishers. This time, Emily agreed to give me an exclusive interview. No other publishers or writers had managed to interview her firsthand. Your reputation has changed a lot after this surgery, hasn't it? Upon my question, Emily nodded slightly with a troubled expression. While she was glad to be recognized, she didn't want the excessive attention. She wanted to prioritize her time with her patients rather than being tied up with too many interviews and such. She stated this in her typical straightforward manner. I didn't achieve this with my strength alone. It feels like there was some kind of trigger, right? With a casual demeanor, I questioned her. Emily gave me a brief, sharp look. I pretended not to notice and smiled back. Yes, my classmate who got scared and fled the scene, and the daughter of my mentor who harshly criticized me. These two fueled my competitive spirit. I clawed my way up, telling them not to underestimate me. While she was smiling, her eyes weren't. It seemed she held a deep grudge about that time. I responded with a detached tone that must have been tough and proceeded with the interview. I talked for nearly an hour and the interview was over. The moment I turned off my voice recorder, Emily said, I'm beat, stretching out big. You didn't have to be so formal in your answers, you know. When I said this to the seemingly tense Emily, she responded, I couldn't just take it lightly. I mean, who knows what you're going to write? When she becomes casual, it feels like we're back in our college days in an instant. By the way, I met Ava recently. Emily said this with a somewhat troubled smile. It seems she bumped into Ava when she visited Professor Johnson's grave the other day. At that time, Ava talked about why she had said certain things during the funeral. Seems she wanted to bring me down to hell. Her plan worked perfectly, Emily said, taking a sip from her now cold coffee. Why, if it's related to Professor Johnson, that's more than just holding a grudge. I raised my voice when I learned that Ava had intentionally attacked Emily. Back then, I defended Ava's rude behavior, thinking she was just distraught over losing her father. Well, about that. With a wry smile, Emily told me the truth that Ava had shared. She couldn't stand the girl who lived with the boy she liked. Wait, what? Caught off guard by this unexpected twist, I replied in surprise. I never noticed any signs that Ava had feelings for me. And certainly not now. Has it always been just me in your heart? Emily asked, pointing at my chest. For the past 7 years, no, probably since we broke up, that's how I've felt deep inside. This feeling that I have been hiding inside me for a long time. We've been stubborn, but it seems like it's time for us to move on. Ava, you know, she's a genius at reading people. Don't praise another woman when one's confessing her feelings to you with all her heart. Emily puffed up her cheeks. She was just like the Emily I dated in college. It was a nostalgic side of Emily. We sure took the long way round. I feel like we can walk through life together from now on. Now, how should I convey this to Emily? I carefully chose my words, wanting to tell her just that. Hope you enjoyed this. Subscribing to our channel will be a great encouragement for us. See you in the next video.